80-20 QT phase 2, this time Brook and Uronema, 80% of those results, 20% of the effort, and this is easy, but there are some caveats. Starting with what makes Brook different than ick or velvet?
So Brook, it's short for brooklynella. It's typically really common in wild clownfish. Sometimes it's called clownfish disease. But basically it is a direct ciliate contact parasite. The entire life cycle of the parasite actually is occurring on the fish. It does make it easier to treat, but the symptoms typically are that the skin on the fish actually looks like it's peeling off. Sometimes it looks like the fish has cobwebs all over it. With clownfish, really good indication of, especially if wild clownfish come in, if they are carrying brooklynella, the dorsal and ventral fins a lot of times will be clamped and the body will kind of almost be rigid or stiff looking. And they won't have like this normal, almost playful clownfish up and down swimming pattern. The respiration will also be incredibly labored. And their head is typically pointed a little bit upwards as well.
So I've ran into this twice. One was on a clownfish and it looks terrible. And the other one actually was just as terrible, which was engineer gobies. And probably just got exposed to a wild clownfish. So it does happen to any fish that is exposed to this as well. How treatable is it at that point?
It's pretty difficult, especially on clownfish. Some other fish, other species, you know, if you catch it relatively early, it's pretty treatable. The fish is relatively savable, but especially on clownfish, you definitely have to be a lot more aggressive about treating it.
Yeah, so some of what we're going to talk about today is actually more about prevention and making sure that this didn't make it into a tank than it is about treatment. But there is some crossover, and we'll explain that in just a minute. All right, so one of the other big differences between Brook and ick and velvet is that it's not effective with or responsive to copper. It's responsive to something else, and this is probably going to be a big decision tree for a lot of you.
Yeah, so the ideal treatment for brooklynella, it's formalin. Formalin is 37% formaldehyde diluted in water. It is a known carcinogen. It's incredibly toxic stuff. We at Marine Collectors, like I am the only one who uses formalin. I do the dips and the dosing after everyone goes home. When we do system doses, I do them at night when no one's in the building. And then I come in early and I ventilate the warehouse before people start coming in, you know, showing up for work.
Okay.
We're dealing with a lot of unknowns and it's just better to err on the side of caution.
I'd love to tell you exactly how carcinogenic it is, how bad this is. And the answer is, if you look it up, it says it's like causes leukemia. But also formaldehyde's in all kinds of things in our houses. Basically every new house, plywood, pressed board, it's in all kinds of things. I don't know the difference between whether or not this is going to cause you leukemia for sure, or if it's the equivalent to smoking a single cigarette. You're going to have to make that decision for yourself through some research. So this is that decision tree between, yeah, this is actually really easy and it does kind of fit the 80-20 model, but you're going to want to be, you know, wear a mask and protect yourself. And there is a difference between what's gassed off here and whether or not you spilled it all over the floor and like took a big, huge breath of it. So the most common, the most recommended solution here requires a different level of safety techniques than is common to somebody who's doing this for the first time. All right, next, Uronema. What makes this one different than ick and velvet as well?
All right, so just like Brook, it is a direct contact ciliate parasite. We treat it in a very similar way. Uronema, it'll often present on chromis. Sometimes it's called chromis disease. But basically they are like large red sores on the fish. It also usually affects fish that don't ship very well. So a lot of times you can see it on butterflies and anthias. You know, once this actual physical symptoms start manifesting, it's almost impossible to save the fish, which is why we want to look at prophylactic treatment in the first place.
Yeah, so a lot of what we're going to talk about today is prevention, not treatment, because treatment, if you're doing this for your first time, and like really low outcome. In fact, low outcome for a lot of experienced people. And in fact, this is one of those areas with Uronema where it's not as well understood as the other diseases and the treatments aren't as universally agreed on. Almost everybody will tell you the formalin works for sure, but there's some discussion about how, you know, a period of freshwater dips or hydrogen peroxide or different things work, but we haven't found universal agreement on all those things. So you're just going to see a lot of debate on this one. Also, another difference between Uronema and all the other ones we've done so far is that once it's in the tank, you should probably consider that it's there forever. Because unlike Brook and Ick and Velvet, a Uronema actually doesn't need a fish to prey on. It actually preys on all the detritus and other garbage that's in your tank. And more so, it's really just kind of opportunistic, the fact that it can find like an open wound or area between the scales to attack.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of times, it's what we often think is that fish come in, they're slightly damaged from shipping. They come into contact with Uronema. Uronema will sometimes jump onto the dead decaying tissue to eat all of the decaying organic matter. And then once it's been consumed, they'll actually move on to the living tissue as well.
All right. I've actually heard multiple people tell me stories of actually their best treatment for Uronema is actually to take that sick fish and put it in a healthy tank. Don't do that. But it's important to note that a healthy microbiome or all the healthy bacteria that's in a tank can actually overpower the sore that's on it that it otherwise wouldn't have. Now, the reason I say don't do that is because nobody wants to have an outbreak of this in your tank, and you don't know whether or not your tank is healthy enough to solve that. But it is important to note because this is the life cycle and how it behaves. Another difference here between that Ick and the Velvet is the Formalin thing again. Decide for yourself, do some research for yourself. And even Elliot doesn't do this around his own employees, takes all of the safety measures at marine collectors when using this material because it isn't healthy for you. You're gonna have to make that decision for yourself. All right, prevention QT for Brook and Uronema. Luckily, it looks very, very similar because it is the exact same thing as the Ick and Velvet, just with an extra process. So if you haven't seen phase 1 with Ick and Velvet, go watch that because there's just a tiny tweak to this and you can solve for these two.
Yeah, so we're going to look at phase 1 of this quarantine protocol as kind of our base, and we're just going to build on it. That initial freshwater bath that I said we should do, we can replace that with formalin. Formalin actually will kill flukes as well. And you can see them fall off the fish just like you would in a freshwater dip. And then on the subsequent days, days 3, 6, 9, and so on, every 3 days when we're already going to be doing a water change, you can do that 35-minute bath at that point in time. We're also going to sanitize the tank at that step as well, just so that when we're putting the fish back in, it's going into a very clean environment.
All right, so step 1, we told you last week that it would take about 10 minutes to do the water change. This time it's going to take about 35 because?
Yeah, so when we pull that fish out, we're going to do a formalin dip, or a formalin bath rather, sorry. What it's going to look like is you're going to do a dosage of 1 ml per gallon of water formalin. We're going to put an air stone in that bucket as well, so we have good oxygenation. Formalin actually does strip the water of oxygen a little bit. We want to make sure that that fish isn't going to have trouble with normal respiration. And then while that fish is actually in that bath, what we're going to do is we're going to clean this best we can. My personal recommendation is to actually fill it up with fresh water. Let it sit for 10 minutes. What that's going to do is the fresh water is going to kill off all of the Uronema and Brook that was potentially falling off the fish that's still in this tank with osmotic shock. Drain it back down, fill it back up with your medicated water, and that's all you need to do.
While those things are sitting in that bath for 35 minutes, and by the way, the formalin you're looking for is called 37%. Don't pick anything else. Then during that process, while we're doing the bath, fill it up with the fresh water, let that osmotic shock kill off everything in there. It's not sterilizing the tank, but it's killing what we want to kill. And then just put it back in after you've filled it back up, just like you would for the Ick and Velvet, and then repeat that process every time during this. So for the 4 additional process, mission accomplished. Brook and Uronema now probably not going to ever be an issue in your tanks. All right. Caveats, stipulations to Brook and Uronema are longer than Ick and Velvet as well. Starting with, if you have really sensitive fish, you should do the process a little different.
Yeah, so if, let's say you're doing flasher wrasses, fairy wrasses, stuff that already is going to have a hard time in copper, we don't want to add to that stress by also doing formalin dips. I would just do the phase 1 by itself. Then when you're done, remove the fish, make sure that we clean this tank out. My personal recommendation is either bleach it or just use a different tank. That way you're not potentially reusing the same QT system that might contain Ick or Velvet in there and then reinfecting it with unmedicated water. what we'll do is then refill that tank with unmedicated water. We will still actually want to do the nitrofurazone, but we won't do the copper. And then you're going to follow that same 3-day split protocol, but just do the formalin by itself.
All right, just for clarification, when you go do this for these sensitive fish, do the exact phase 1 protocol the way that you saw in that video. Don't deviate from it all.
Yep.
Then essentially go repeat it, but this time without the copper, and then replace in those formalin dips during those water changes, and then you'll solve for both, and you'll do it for more delicate fish. Another caveat here is if you're doing chromis, I don't know, this might be the first step.
Yeah, so if you got fish that you know are extra prone, or you think might have been in a system that had Uronema, or maybe you suspect that Uronema might be developing, do this first. Do the formalin before you do phase 1, or do it in conjunction with phase 1. Uronema does move really rapidly, so if it is a fish that is infected, it's definitely better to treat that first with formalin than do the copper.
I think I would call this true of any disease. If you can physically see that disease, or you know that that fish is uniquely prone to that disease, maybe you should do that one first. Another caveat to this is a bath in formalin or formaldehyde is actually a pretty harsh treatment, and not all of the fish will actually need it.
Yeah, I mean, very, very few fish are ever exposed to Brook. Usually that's primarily a clownfish thing, which makes this part of the quarantine phase really unnecessary. Formaldehyde, it's toxic to us, it's toxic to the fish. A lot of these chemicals that we use, if we don't need to, it's probably better not to, especially when you're considering your own health. But definitely use your best judgment. Only do this if you think that the fish is prone or carrying or potentially already infected with these things.
So if you're not reading between the lines here, everybody should do phase 1. It's really easy. Do it I'd say do it for ick, but really do it for velvet. And by solving velvet, you just happen to solve ick as well. This one, I don't know if I would say that this is perfect for the first time QT.
Yeah. A lot of anecdotal data in here.
It is a progression path. It is part of a journey of essentially learning how to be a fish vet and how to do it responsibly and how to recognize the signs and learn. So I would start with phase 1 and then build upon it. Another caveat here is formalin isn't the only answer. It just happens to be the most effective of the answers that we know. There are some experimental or options that seem to work sometimes, just not all the time.
Yeah, so anecdotally in the hobby and in the industry, we've seen freshwater dips definitely help Uronema and manage brooklynella. I can personally say from my own experience that years ago, we used to only dip freshwater or clownfish in freshwater dips. We would do the dips 8 hours apart every day for like the first week. And the fish usually do pretty well, but it's not foolproof. Another option, chloroquine phosphate. I've seen it work to cure Uronema and brooklynella, but I've also seen it not. So use your own judgment. If you think that the formalin aspect is going to be too abrasive for you and you want to try the lesser options, that's definitely out there for you.
I've also seen people exploring using hydrogen peroxide for some of these types of diseases. So you might want to research that as well. If formalin isn't right for you, the only reason that we're not documenting this and saying do it this way out of us is because a lot of these things are hit or miss or experimental, and that's not the kind of advice that we can give. Another caveat, or actually just kind of extension of things that you could do for Uronema, is you could feed Metro.
Yeah, so metronidazole, it's often used in a gut cleaner to actually force Uronema out of the intestinal tract. I'm a little bit, got mixed reviews on it just because I don't know it to be foolproof all the time, but you could do that as well.
To me, it's somewhat makes sound logic, and sometimes sounds logic actually works, and sometimes it just feel good. So it isn't part of the protocol that we developed today, but you could add that in. How would I feed Metro if I wanted to?
So actually, if you're just going to do a gut cleaner in general, my recommendation is actually do metronidazole, kanamycin, and optional prazi, especially if you think that your fish might have internal flagellates. And then you'll bind that with like a frozen food like PD mice or something and focus. It's a product made by Seachem, but basically it will bind those medications to the solid fish food and make it stick to it so the fish actually ingests the medication.
So you had me do that for Popeye on one of the fishes, right? What it is, that focus is actually kind of like a putty, and you mix in the powders in with the focus, bind it all up to something tasty, and then the fish will eat the whole thing and ingest it. So that is an option. You could add it to this whole mix if you'd like. All right, so because of all of those caveats, I think it's reasonable to say that phase 2 here is what I'd call optional, or at least something that you would work your way up to as part of the whole QT process. Again, do the ick and velvet for sure, but this one, it might be something that you grow into. And when I say optional, I gotta tell you, for me, optional means my option is actually to have people like marine collectors do this for me. He's doing it in a professional environment, managing all of the risks of the formalin safely there. And I don't have to expose my household to spilling on the floor or my kids crawling through it or anything like that. So think about how important that is. And there are other options in doing it at home, but now we've told you how to do it really cheaply at home as well. All right, so what's next? Phase 3, we're talking flukes now. And to be honest, if you did that formalin step here, you probably wiped out most of the flukes as well, but not necessarily all.
Yeah, just anecdotally, I've seen formalin not knock out all the gill flukes. It could just be a matter of frequency or the type of actual gill fluke that the fish have. But if you want to be absolutely sure that the flukes are eradicated, we're going to show you how to do it.
Yeah, phase 3, get those flukes out of the tank, especially if you skip phase 2. This is how you're going to do it. Playlist right here.